So, the progressive era is also the last lecture in Unit 1. And it's a nice way to wrap up this unit because, in a lot of ways, it helps us to bring a little bit of finality to this particular era of, or this particular group of lessons in some ways. But it also brings some semblance of continuation in a weird way. So this in particular is a time period uh, of reform, and it happens at every possible level, which is why the theme for this lecture and the theme for this chapter, which is chapter 18, is accountability. Accountability means, as you know, hopefully, if not, look it up, but accountability means that people are held responsible for their actions, whether it is in business or in politics or even at the social level, that people are held responsible for what they do. And that's what the progressive era is all about, that we are held responsible for how we treat one another, for how our workers are treated, how our citizens are treated. And that's what's taking place in the progressive era. When we talk about the progressives, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind here is that the progressives have a tendency. Let me go back here for 1 second. The progressives are immediately compared to the populists, and rightfully so. So I want to do that very quickly. Populists and progressives are both trying to bring about change, right? And that's important for you to remember. But there are differences between the two groups, in that populists are a working class movement, and progressives are not that. Progressives are largely middle class. Progressives are better educated. They're going to be more professional. And progressives are not entirely focused on being a political movement. Progressives are going to bring about change in every different way that they can. Remember, with the populists, they were focused entirely on political reform, right? They wanted to get a guy in the White House because they thought that the only way to bring about change was from the top down, that they had to put someone in the White House, and by having a president, that's how they would bring about change. But progressives weren't like that. And if you look at how uh, Eric Foner starts his chapter, he tells the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company and how all of these young people, these workers, died as a result of this fire that was entirely preventable. But what happens as a result of their tragic deaths is all of these protective legislative reforms from women who were progressives, right? Who were pushing for reforms. And these reforms happen at state and local levels. And they weren't just women progressive organizations. There were other reform workers as well, progressives at every level who were pushing for reform. And it doesn't have to happen politically. It happens in the workforce. It happens socially. So progressives are going to have a different kind of mindset from populists, in that as long as reform happens, that's all that matters. So I want to start by talking about muckrakers, which he talks about on page 693. Muckraking was a type of journalism. I don't want you to confuse that with yellow press, because in the previous chapter, he mentioned William Randolph Hearst and the yellow press or yellow journalism. This is a completely different type of journalism. Muckraking was basically raking the muck from it's think of it as farm work, right? You're raking the muck from the stalls. In other words, what these journalists were doing was exposing all of the yuck, all of the greed, and all of the disgusting things that were taking place in industry and politics, and exposing it to American citizens, and basically saying, look at what's actually happening in our industries, in our businesses, in our government, and showing, as he puts it, as Foner puts it, the underside of life, right? What you see here are a couple of examples of the results of muckraking. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed the meatpacking industry. It was a novel. He mentions it here. It was a novel published in 1906 that described slaughterhouses and the meatpacking industry, which led to, as he talks about, the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as the Meat Inspection Act, but also Ida B. Wells' The Southern Horrors, where she talked about lynching laws, and talked about how Black men and women, as well as Black children, were being lynched all throughout the South, and without any cause, without any due process, and how people needed to pay attention to the lack of law enforcement, to the lack of legal protection for Black men and women and children throughout the South, despite the fact that they were citizens of the United States. He also goes into the fact that progressivism really addresses the issue of immigration and the process of immigration, and how immigration needed to be sort of a process where it had to be a story that was celebrated, right? On the picture, in the picture on the left, you see a photograph of immigrants being processed through Ellis Island, which he explains there on pages 694 and 695. And he talks about the process through which these people are coming into the United States for the purpose of freedom, to be able to experience what it was like to come to the United States. And he explains where they're coming from, but then says why they're coming, right? Their stories and why it matters and who they are. And this whole process of being able to not only come here, but then to be a part of the American society, including to be a member of American consumer society, is very much a part of the American experience, right? It's interesting because when we talk about the progressive era, it's not entirely about reform and changing things all the time, right? A lot of people, when they talk about the progressive era, they think that it's a bunch of goody two-shoes who are trying to save the world all the time. And that's not necessarily it. It is a story of people who are trying to reestablish what the American dream is about. And the American dream, for a lot of progressives, is just about people who are trying to be a part of a capitalist society, and trying to not only participate in it, but partake of it, right? They want to be able to achieve their own capitalist dreams, to be able to become, to be able to live comfortably and have their own opportunities. And that's where we get the American standard of living, the idea that you shouldn't just have a wage where you just get by. It's about being able to live comfortably, to be able to have a wage where you are able to afford whatever you want and not just what you need. And that's on pages 700 into 701, that you should be able to get into a home that you can not only pay for, but you can afford, that you can live comfortably. That's the kind of living that you should be able to have in a truly fair capitalist society, and not just a capitalist society. It needs to be fair and accessible to all Americans who are willing and able to work for it. That's key, right? That you are willing and able to work for it. Now, here's something that's really important. There are different and varying types of progressivism that he starts talking about on page 701. And he gets into the fact that there is this idea of people who are focused entirely on progressivism as it relates to how people work, right? So this is where he explains efficiency in terms of productivity. And so this is where he talks about things like scientific management, how people are effectively or most effectively managed in the workplace so that they can produce the best. Or when we get into questions about how they can most effectively produce in terms of workplaces where people are producing or doing the same thing over and over and over again. That's something that is created during this time period thanks to guys like Henry Ford. Another thing that is another type of progressivism, of course, is the fact that socialism becomes a prominent presence in the United States, including in the state of Oklahoma. When Oklahoma becomes a state in 1906 and into 1907, socialism is a really important and influential presence for several years. In fact, Oklahoma will have the largest and most influential presence in the country per capita, including compared to the state of New York. We will have the largest number of socialist office holders in the country. And that's largely because of farmers who will vote for socialists. And a lot of that is due to the fact that all socialists were progressive. Not all progressives were socialists, but all socialists were progressives. Socialists were just considered radical progressives, right? I mean, these were people who had loyalists across the country, so much so that one of their leading voices, of course, is a guy named Eugene Debs, who you see pictured on the left there. Eugene Debs is someone who is so popular that he will run for president and win over 1 million votes, and he does incredibly well because he's incredibly popular. There are also one type of progressivism that becomes very popular is seeing immigrants go on strike. And in fact, he gets into this on page 705, but this happens a lot, to see conflict with labor. And the fact that you have labor unions demand better working conditions, better pay. This sort of thing happens often. And that's important because the fact that they feel more comfortable demanding better working conditions and demanding better working rights is important. That leads to the issue of civil liberties for workers. The whole idea that workers should have, these opportunities for freedom of expression is incredibly important, right? On page 707, you'll read more about that, including an introduction into someone named Mother Jones. Mary Jones is incredibly important in the history of labor unions. She's incredibly important, and you will read about her and how vital she is to the history of unions in this country. Another type of progressivism that you should know about that is vital to progressivism is the idea of feminism. Feminism is not new. Feminism is something that emerges in the early 1900s. Feminism is about equality, the equality of women. It is not about the elimination of men. It is not about the hatred of men. It is about the basic principle about the equality of women. And it's not about the political equality of women. It is not about the social equality of women. It's about the overall equality of women. That a woman should have the right to decide for herself who she is, what she should be, what she should do, what her opinion is, what her identity is. Those are the basic tenets. Those are the basic principles, the basic values of feminism, that a woman has the ability to decide for herself what her identity is, who she is as a person, as an individual. That's the basic principle of feminism. That's it. That's literally it. But the very concept of that was such a threat, because to think that a woman could have something, to have that much um, autonomy for herself, was really so outside of the concept of what was normal then, and so outside of the concept of what was socially acceptable, that immediately there was backlash. But really, feminism is just the basic idea of, as an individual, you should have the right to decide for yourself who you are, who you want to be, what you want to do with your life, even though you're a woman. That's it. That's literally what feminism is, was, and that's it. Now, associated with that, of course, is the emergence of the birth control movement. Birth control had been relatively new at that point, and had emerged relatively recently, considering. And at the forefront of that is a couple of activists, one being Emma Goldman, who had long been a socialist and activist, and then, of course, Margaret Sanger. And these two women had been advocates primarily because they had witnessed a lot of working class women who were subject to having a lot of children, even though they didn't want to have a lot of children, even though their bodies had been pushed to the limits of childbearing, even though their families could not afford to have that many children, but they still wanted to be intimate with their husbands. They the idea that a woman could be a sexual creature or a sexual being was a foreign concept to a lot of people. And the fact that these two women would advocate for such a thing was considered absolutely unacceptable. But Foner talks about this in more detail on pages 711 and 712. So make sure you read up on that as well. When we get into progressivism, the politics of progressivism is really sort of fascinating, because there's a really important there are really important ways to think about how progressivism is sort of presented, right? There is the idea of effective freedom, meaning when you talk about progressivism, the idea is how is your power being used? Is it being used to actually get things done? And that's what you need to understand from the reading. There's also the idea of pragmatism, right? Pragmatism is a concept that emerged in the late 19th century. And the idea, of course, as you'll read on page 714, in this section, is a way to sort of help navigate between between the concepts of being effective religiously, at the same time using science to help create plans on making yourself more effective. So essentially, pragmatism is that bridge between religion and science. That's something that you'll need to read up on as well. the other way of getting into the politics of progressivism is how to best use progressivism, right? And that's also best seen in state and local reforms. Remember, this is where populism really falls apart. Populism focused on national politics, wanting to change things from the top down. Progressives are like, no, we can do things from the bottom up. We can start changing things locally from the ground up. And so you'll read examples of how they do that on pages 714 to 715. Progressivism in the West is really interesting as well, because Westerners find ways to have citizens hold their leaders accountable in the most direct ways. One of them being, or actually three of them being, initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative being ways where citizens can introduce bills to the state legislature. Referendum being a way that state legislatures can have voters vote on bills. Referendum is something that we have here in Oklahoma. Recall is when citizens can recall their leaders and try to remove a leader from their position in office. That's something that California has in place. A progressive democracy. A progressive democracy is one where citizens have direct control over who they vote into office. A great example of this, and this is Foner's example on pages 716 into 717, is from the 17th Amendment, where citizens finally have the right to vote for senators directly rather than have them being voted for by state legislatures, which is what happened previously. So we get to vote for our senators directly. Progressives also pushed for experts in social sciences like sociology and psychology, experts in being able to understand the needs of people, experts in business, experts in how people worked with each other. And those experts would contribute to conversations so that people could reach conclusions and solutions in a better and more effective way. This was unheard of. The idea that you would do studies on how to best implement a more effective way for railroad companies and farmers to do business with one another, or a more effective way for utility companies to have a relationship with the cities that they are located in. That was something that had never been done before. Jane Addams is a really good example of this. On page 718, he talks about Jane Addams and Hull House. Hull House was the first settlement house that had ever been created. It was established in Chicago, but it was designed to help immigrant women and their children settle into America and make the transition from immigrant into eventually citizen. The idea was Jane Addams was trained as a social worker, and she hired other social workers and medical workers and that sort of thing and people in education to help these women and help these children to learn the language, to get training in different job areas. To help these people to transition into American life and to assimilate into American life. Progressivism doesn't just stop at the local level. Progressivism translates into the presidency because it is such a hugely influential movement. It is incredibly powerful and effective. And Theodore Roosevelt is the most powerful, the most effective example of a progressive president. There are three examples of progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. But the most powerful, the most effective, the most influential progressive president is Theodore Roosevelt. And the reason why I emphasize him is because Theodore Roosevelt comes into this job with the belief that the purpose of being in government is to serve the people, that it is his responsibility as a government official, whether he's the governor, whether you are a congressman, if you are a senator, whether you're the janitor guy, it does not matter. You are there in service to the people. And that is your one and only responsibility. And so he takes that incredibly seriously. And when he talks about his responsibility as being in service to the people, the one big thing that he will keep in mind is this idea that no man is above the law, right? So he takes that idea of accountability as far as he can take it. So over the course of his time as president, he'll take over for William McKinley after McKinley is assassinated, and when he becomes president, he immediately takes on this role of accountability as the president. And what is really important is the story that Foner tells, starting on page 723. He calls his program the Square Deal. And the whole idea of being the Square Deal is to make everything basically create a program of fairness, right? That everything is straight up and in your face. There is no way around it. There are no loopholes, and he's going to hold everybody accountable. That includes big wigs, right? And the big wig that he goes after, as Foner talks about on page 724, is J.P. Morgan, the wealthiest man in America. And of course, he's going after J.P. Morgan because he is the wealthiest man in America. And he wants to send a message, right? Roosevelt wants to send a message to everyone. And the message is, you're next. So I want you to read up on what happens because remember the Sherman Antitrust Act that the government really wasn't enforcing, even though it was a law on the books? Roosevelt decided it was time to enforce it. Yeah, Roosevelt is really fun. He's one of my favorites to talk about, primarily because he's the guy that everyone notices. There can be 5,000 people in a room, but as soon as he walks in, all eyes are on him because he's just that kind of guy. So, and if you're interested, I have a really excellent story. I have a few excellent stories. So email me and ask. Okay. So when we talk about Roosevelt as the progressive president, he's going to push for things like economic regulation. He's going to push for things like environmental conservation. He's going to push for things like holding people accountable in every which way. His hand-appointed successor, William Howard Taft, is going to try to do the same things. He's a huge disappointment to Theodore Roosevelt. That's a separate story. The guy who comes after Taft is Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is interesting because Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive Democrat. And that just goes to show you progressivism was not a party affiliation, right? So you could be a Democrat or a Republican and still be progressive. So it didn't matter what your party affiliation was. It just mattered how you approached the the different issues. And so Woodrow Wilson identified himself as a progressive, and he also believed that there was a need to use government to push for greater accountability. And so he was going to push this idea of, um, expanding the role of government, which he gets into, which Foner gets into on page 730. He talks about, um, you know, how Wilson's policies seem a lot more in tune with Roosevelt's ideas of new nationalism, which new nationalism is really explained really well on page 728. So if you want to better understand that, then make sure that you go into that. But Wilson is someone who is going to really push for the Federal Reserve System, which helps to uh, look into greater government supervision of the economy, as well as set up the banking system and all of these things. He likes the idea of having a strong central government, and he likes the idea of creating a domestic policy that emphasizes the good that government can do, which is right in line with what a lot of progressives believe. Progressives believe that the government can do a lot of good if the government holds everyone accountable, and that's the point.